In this lesson we are gonna take a look at the features the program has to handle the way an object looks. One of the most important dialogs in the entire program is the fill and stroke. In a previous lesson I showed you how to quickly set the fill and stroke color of an object using the palette. But this dialog contains the full set of options. To open it, go to Object, Fill and Stroke. The Fill and Stroke dialog has 3 tabs. The first and second tab, the Fill and Stroke tab, have the exact same options. Depending on the selected tab, the options will be applied to either the fill or stroke. The last tab handles other properties of the stroke, but most important, the width. Let's begin with the Fill and Stroke Paint tab. Since both have the exact same options, I'll show you the options with the Fill tab selected. The first thing you'll see are these 8 boxes on top. These change the type of paint you'll give to the object. Even though there are 8 different buttons, practically you'll only be using the first 2. The other ones are used for other features more important for graphic design, or they give redundant information. So forget about the other 6 and concentrate on the first 2. The X means no paint whatsoever. In a previous lesson I told you that in Inkscape you cannot remove either fill or stroke, you can only hide it. Well, the X will hide either fill or stroke depending on the tab you are. This button does the exact same thing that the white X in the palette. Then is the flat color button. This does the same thing than picking a color in the palette. It gives either the fill or stroke a solid color. But the difference is that now you get the full set of options to pick the color you want. First, as soon as you click on the option, 5 new buttons appear. These are actually tabs, each with a different color selection mode. They all give you the same colors, but depending on your needs, it could be easier picking one or another. For illustration, you'll be using either the wheel or the HSL mode. You can forget about the other ones. No matter what color mode you pick, down below there is the RGBA label and the dropper. The dropper is the classic tool that lets you sample colors. And the RGBA label has the hexadecimal numbers of the selected color. Here you can copy that number and store the exact color you have selected, or paste the color in hexadecimal notation. The Stroke Style tab has all the options related to the stroke. Of course, the most important here is the width. This is the option you'll be handling all the time. Right next to the width number, there is a drop-down with the default value of millimeters. This is the unit. Since Inkscape is a graphic design software first, it displays by default a unit that is useful for print, but you can change that unit to something more useful for illustration. I recommend you to make all adjustments using the px or pixels unit. Notice that when you change to a new unit, the width value gets converted. Less useful for illustration are the dashes and markers options. The dashes add different types of dashes to the stroke, and the markers add symbols to different parts of the stroke. This is mostly used to create things like arrows for diagrams and maps. A little more useful are the join and cap options. The join changes the way the stroke looks in a corner. If you have a thick stroke, it may be worth to play around with the type of join so the stroke won't call attention to itself. The cap is just like the join option, but only for the unknowns. And the order changes the order of the stroke, fill and markers. For illustration, you can live without worrying about these options. Independent of the tabs, there are 2 sliders. The first one adds a blur effect to the entire object, both for fill and stroke. And the second one sets the opacity of the entire object. One important thing to keep in mind is that this slider is completely separated from the alpha value in the Fill and Stroke Paint tab. You can create gradients by using the gradient tool in the toolbox. Depending on which option is set in the tool controls bar, you'll create either a linear or radial gradient when you drag. Right next to the linear and radial options are the stroke and fill options. Here you can choose to what is the gradient gonna be applied to. To set the colors, just click on the stops in the handle and then select a color. You can move the handle at any moment after you created it by using either the gradient tool or the node selection tool. With the gradient tool selected, you can double click in any section of the handle, and this will create a new stop. Gradients in Inkscape behave just like gradients in any other program. The color will be linearly changed from the color of one stop to another. In the tool controls bar, there are a couple of useful options. This button will reverse the gradient so you don't have to manually rotate the handle. This drop-down will change what happens after the two end stops. By default, the end stop color goes on, but you can make it repeat the pattern or repeat the pattern back to back. If you open the Fill and Stroke dialog and choose the third or fourth button, you'll see a list of all the gradients you've created. By selecting one, you can apply it to the object. Here you can also duplicate and modify an existing gradient. All of the options you'll see here are found in the gradient tool controls. You can, if you prefer, handle the gradients application from here. But I found it's way easier not to worry about this panel and control everything from the tool controls bar of the gradient tool. Inkscape has a fully implemented mesh gradient functionality. While not as advanced as the mesh gradient in a program like Illustrator, it can do its job fairly decently, so it's worth to take a look. A mesh gradient is similar to a normal gradient with the difference that you can place and manipulate stops in all directions. To set a mesh gradient to an object, select the mesh tool and double-click on the object. Just like with the gradients, you can choose the type in the tool controls bar. The first option will create a matrix of stops. The second option will create a conical mesh. This is similar to the radial gradient, only that you can add more than one row of stops. To set a color is similar to a normal gradient. Simply select a stop and set a color. With the mesh tool selected, you can drag to select multiple stops and set the color to all of them together. This can only be done with the gradient tool. Since now we're working with meshes, you can set the rows and columns. Sadly, you cannot add or remove rows or columns dynamically. The changes are only applied when you create a new mesh. However, it's possible to interactively add rows and columns. Just double-click in a pre-existing row or column with the mesh tool selected, and a new one will be created. So it's always best to create a mesh with a few rows and columns and then add more as needed. Just like with the gradient, you can move a stop, but the difference is that now you can move to whatever you want. Another new thing is these little circles around a node that transform to triangles when you select a stop. These control the spread of a color of a stop. If you start moving them, you'll see that the row and column line is also moving to indicate the way the stop affects the color. With these options, you have complete control over the color of an object, and you can do really advanced shading that will be really hard to do without it. As far as other options, just like with normal curves, there is an option to make a segment straight or curve. If you mess too much the shape of the mesh, you can fit it inside an object with this button. A really nice option is the ability to enable and disable the stop indicators. This way it's easier to see the stops you have. Just like with the gradients, there is a button in the fill and stroke dialog to select this type of fill. Again, you don't need to use it for anything except maybe to switch between existing meshes. Filters are visual effects programmed inside Inkscape itself that are somehow similar looking to pixel effects, but are still inside the SVG standard. You can open the filter editor by going to Filters, Filter. Here you can create the effect by applying and removing pre-existing effects and changing the parameters. Creating effect is its own subject and you're rarely gonna have to touch this dialog. However, Inkscape comes with hundreds of built-in effects for you to use, pretty much securing that you won't ever need to create your own. To access the filters, go to Filters, and there choose the one you like. Because filters are not pixel-based, they can really cause a slowdown, especially if you zoom right in. I'm gonna be honest, I don't like using filters. I prefer working in a pixel software like GIMP or Krita and importing an image to the program. I feel that this way it's way more effective and you get exactly what you want. Speaking of importing an image, you can import an image or any type of vector file to the document by going to File, Import. Or my favorite method by dragging from the OS to the canvas. Once you import the image, a small dialog will appear. You can skip this just clicking OK. Images are objects and they can be manipulated with the object selection tool. You can apply blur and opacity from the fill and stroke dialog, but not colors. You can also apply filters from the filter menu and most importantly blend modes from the object or layer dialog. Pixel-based extensions, mostly from the raster menu, work as well.